So the Supreme Court bar elections are not far away. You've held the position as the president for 4 terms now. How do you see the upcoming elections and what are the issues that will dominate the bar politics?
The Supreme Court elections are now due sometime in August of this year. And since I've already done 4 terms, I'm not, obviously, there is a cap of being elected as president of the Supreme Court bar for a maximum period of 4 terms. And since those 4 terms are over, I can't contest. But obviously, I still feel that the right person should be elected to the Supreme Court. And while doing so, there are certain reforms which we had suggested to the Supreme Court, because there is a matter on the judicial side where the Supreme Court is examining how these elections should be contested fairly and who all should be allowed to contest these elections and who should be allowed to vote at these elections. Now, this election to the Supreme Court has had a history. This cap was introduced at a time when the Supreme Court did not have any control on its voters. So anybody who was a voter in Tisari or in Patiala House or the Delhi High Court, he was all permitted to come and vote here. In fact, I remember a time, I will not name the president then, because unfortunately he is no more, where bus loads of voters used to come from Saharanpur and Meerut to vote in the Supreme Court election. So it was in those circumstances that a cap was brought in, that it was felt that people are, controlling this election in this unfair way and continuing to hold on indiscriminately. Now the election is limited to actual voters. And when we say actual practitioners of Supreme Court, and when we say actual practitioners, there are certain criteria which have been spelled out for active practice in Supreme Court. One of the criteria is that you should be visiting the Supreme Court on a regular basis. The other criteria is that you should have certain number of appearances in Supreme Court. The another criteria is that you should have certain number of filings in Supreme Court. Now, unfortunately, in my last election, I discovered a flaw in the system. So I found out a particular voter whose DP said, "Rishte hi rishte." So I rang him up. So I said, "आप क्या करते हैं? आपका DP तो बता रहा है आप रिश्ते ही." बोला, "ये हमारी एक शादी संस्था है आगरा में, मैं शादी कराता हूँ." तो मैंने कहा कि आप यहाँ सुप्रीम कोर्ट के वोटर भी हैं? बोले, "हाँ हाँ, हम वोटर भी हैं." So then I dug deep. I came to know that somebody was just putting his name in the appearances while filing his own appearances. Now, that's a very disturbing thing. You may be shown to have appeared in Supreme Court while doing Rishte Hi Rishte somewhere in Agra, and then come during the election time and come and vote in the Supreme Court elections. So these are very, very fundamental flaws which are still existing in the voting system, which need to be corrected. There are people who come to Supreme Court only to get their proximity card, to access into the system, and they hardly stay in the Supreme Court and go out. And if you have 60 proximity cards in the Supreme Court, you get your right to vote. So you are not a stakeholder in the institution. You may be practicing in Patiala House or in Tisari, but you just come in the morning, cross the proximity card, just get your proximity card tagged in the system and leave, and you can show that you've been coming to the Supreme Court. So these are things which we have suggested need to be addressed. We have also seen that if there is, supposing somebody's appearance given in the system, and there is a method in the Supreme Court which can identify whether a person is actually in the Supreme Court premise or not by virtue of his proximity card, because every time you enter the Supreme Court, there is a recording of your entry in the Supreme Court, and every time you exit, there is a recording of your exit as well. So if there is a recording of your entry in the Supreme Court, it can clearly be seen whether when the matter was called out, you were in Supreme Court or not. Now, those are the suggestions that we have made as far as the right to vote is concerned, on which we are expecting an order very soon. The other very important issue is who should be allowed to contest, especially for the post of president, vice president, secretary. The Supreme Court, on my application, had made a committee of Justice Nageshwar Rao, L. Nageshwar Rao, retired Supreme Court judge, to look into the electoral reforms in Supreme Court. One of the suggestions of Justice Nageshwar Rao was that anybody to be eligible to contest as president of the Supreme Court bar should have at least 10 reported judgments where he has argued as the lead counsel in the last 10 years. Now, we thought, as the executive committee of the SCBA, President Executive Committee of the SCBA, we discussed this, and we thought that 10 is a little low. We should have at least 20 reported judgments to become the president and 10 reported judgments to become the vice president of the Supreme Court bar. interestingly, the big names who are the ones who are, in the reckoning for contesting as the next president, if the reforms don't happen, have zero reported judgments as lead counsels. Now, if such people are elected as presidents of the bar, and one of them actually got elected earlier also as president of the Supreme Court bar because votes got divided, because so many people start contesting. So this is something which needs to be corrected, that somebody who has zero stake in the institution, who has not really actively contributed to the development of jurisprudence in the Supreme Court can be a candidate and get elected as the president of the bar. So these are again issues which are pending for deliberation by the court, and we are expecting some judgment very soon on these aspects, so that we ensure at least that people who are regularly practicing in Supreme Court are the ones who really vote at the election and are the ones who really get elected at the election. And Supreme Court is one association, according to me, which is being looked up by the entire country. It's the, in some ways, the nodal bar association of the country. The entire country looks up to the Supreme Court bar for guidance. We as a Supreme Court bar have a very, very important role to, ensure that we set the right standards for the entire country, for the lawyers fraternity of this country. We as the Supreme Court Bar Association are actually the only national association in the country where we have the eminent lawyers of every state being members of the Supreme Court Bar. Eminent lawyers. So where a person does well in Bombay, he ultimately travels to Supreme Court. Where a person does well in Chennai, he ultimately travels to Supreme Court. When a person does well in Calcutta or Patna, he travels to Supreme Court. So the best of the brains of the entire country come to Supreme Court to practice, being the highest court of the country. And recently in our national conference, we actually entered into a memorandum of understanding with the Commonwealth Lawyers Association, because they also realize that we are the only association which has the best of lawyers of the country at one place as representing the Supreme Court bar. And accordingly, we are the national bar. That's the importance of the Supreme Court Bar Association. And it is very important that the control of the Supreme Court Bar Association remains with the right people. Because if it goes to the wrong people, you'll be setting up the wrong, example. And the respect which the Supreme Court Bar today commands in the entire country will get eroded. And we will not be able to remain as the voice of the entire country as far as the advocates are concerned, lawyers are concerned. And to maintain that credibility as an institution, and to maintain the leadership or to continue to have that leadership role as a national bar, we should be very particular that the right people vote at this election and the right people get elected at this election. And that's why I consider the election to the Supreme Court bar to be a very important election, which is likely to happen in the near future.